Punch-Out is a fighting game that originated in arcades. However, what makes it unique is that you, instead of being against another player, you're pitted up against a gauntlet of colorful characters. It was a huge success, leading it to get a sequel in being Super Punch-Out. Afterwards, it would get an NES installment, being one of its biggest successes, with many new colorful characters that the series has been so fondly remembered for. Afterwards, it would get an SNES installment, with even more great characters. And years later, it would get a reboot in the form of Punch-Out Wii, with all the characters we know and love. Punch-Out, part of the main appeals is the bosses, which is why today we will be ranking every single one of Punch-Out boxers. To start off this list, that's right, we're gonna take some normal pills, which means we're talking about Mr. Dream. Mr. Dream is one of the most lame boxers. Because the only reason he exists is because of necessity. He has no gimmick, he has no interesting character design, he's quite possibly one of the blandest boxers ever. And sure, he may cheat in his speedruns, but he's not cheating to get higher up on this list. Quite possibly the most boring fighter ever. Sure, he may have appeared in the first Punch-Out arcade game, but when the most interesting thing about your fighter is their name, you probably messed up. The reason he's so low on this list is because he's not that interesting and doesn't really have anything interesting about him. He doesn't really have any standing out gimmick, and sure, his design is unique, but he never really stood out to me. Pizza Pasta is very memorable for all of the wrong reasons. Many longtime viewers may be surprised on how high up Pizza Pasta ended up being, but I enjoy him much more than I used to, mostly out of an ironic stance. Gabby J ultimately is extremely pathetic and even weaker and frailer than Glass Joe. He's also pretty uninteresting. Kid Quick ultimately is pretty boring, but I noticed some things about how his appearance and his fight indicates how he is pretty similar to our protagonist. Kid Quick is an underdog who really stands no chance to any of the opponents in the WVBA. So as his name implies, he has to be quick. He has to dodge and outwit his opponents to have any chance to win. And in that way, he is like our protagonist. Though I may be looking too deep into this, ultimately I feel Kid Quick is pretty interesting and should definitely make a reappearance soon. Bob and Mr. Corlo are slightly bland. However, they have something interesting about them, both of them, and are pretty unique. With Bob being all about rhythm, indicating his fight, and Hoy literally carrying a weapon. However, in my opinion, they are about the same level. However, if I had to put one over the other, then Bob would be 24 and Mr. Corlo ranking 23. Similar to Mr. Corlo and Dream, he's a fighter that cheats. Not very interesting gimmick because it has been done before, but I do quite like his design. I always thought Narcissus Prince's design was pretty solid, and his gimmick of being obsessed with his face is also a pretty good gimmick. He may be somewhat uninteresting, but his design really does stand out. because in my opinion, Super Punch-Out has some of the more bland designs overall. I think Dragon Hand has a pretty interesting design, and his signature kick is also pretty cool. Rick is just an easier meathead version of Nick Boozer. We will talk about Nick later, but I do kind of find it interesting how there is sort of contrast between them, with Rick letting his personality out more and Nick being no nonsense. And then again though, he is pretty lame. Our first Punch-Out NES fighter, and arguably the least interesting one. He doesn't really have any defining characteristic or an interesting gimmick. However, he has leagues more personality, per se, than many of the SNES fighters. But I do think one thing he does do well is being intimidating as an early game boss fight. Bear Hugger is high up and for good reason. In all three of his appearances in Super Punch-Out Arcade, Super Punch-Out SNES, and Punch-Out Wii, he brings an interesting fight with new mechanics. And I think that should be praised, which is why he is up here at number 16. Nick is extremely intimidating, and he does that well. Some say more than Sandman, however, I disagree. I can agree that he is in fact one of the most intimidating bosses in gaming. But if you fight your palette swap right before you, it's quite disadvantaging, which is why he's low on the list.